Story 1. A haunting encounter. Growing up, my neighborhood was far from ideal. It wasn't a place where people lived by choice but rather by necessity. Most of the residents were there because they couldn't afford anything better. The houses were small, outdated, and the local businesses struggled to stay afloat. Many closed within a year or two. As kids, we often found ourselves exploring abandoned places around town, houses and businesses left to the ravages of time. It was a common pastime, and while the police surely knew what was going on, they never seemed to intervene. One of the most intriguing abandoned places for me was my old elementary school. It had closed down years before, and the building had been left to decay. The building's isolated location, on the edge of town and surrounded by a dense forest and a chain-link fence, only added to its creepiness. Despite its original purpose, the setting always struck me as an odd choice for a school. Years after the school's closure, my friend Ryan and I decided to explore it. Neither of us had a car, so we embarked on a 4-mile walk from his house to the school. The trek was long and dark, and as we approached the school, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had accompanied me since childhood. The school loomed ahead, a hulking, dilapidated structure that seemed even more sinister in the dim light of the moon. We climbed over the chain-link fence, its rusty metal scraping against our clothes. Once inside, we headed to the side of the building, hoping to find a way in. Our luck was with us that night. Almost every window had been smashed, providing us with easy access. I went in first, Ryan following close behind. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of decay and dust. We stood in silence for a moment, listening for any signs of life. The building was eerily quiet except for a persistent, hollow creaking noise that seemed to emanate from its very bones. Despite the unsettling sound, it seemed that we were alone. We ventured down the hallway, peeking into the rooms as we went. The once familiar spaces were now in ruins. Desks and chairs were scattered around, and the walls were covered in graffiti and peeling paint. It was strange and melancholy to see the school in such a state after so many years. As we continued to explore, the nostalgia was overshadowed by an increasing sense of discomfort. We had just passed 3 rooms when a sudden, loud thud echoed through the building. We froze, exchanging nervous glances. The sound reverberated off the walls, but no other noises followed. Ryan, trying to remain calm, suggested it was just the building settling. We pressed on, albeit with heightened wariness. The rooms further down the hallway were more cluttered, some filled with broken furniture and remnants of the school's past. We navigated through scattered chairs that blocked our path. Pushing them aside, we made our way to the next hallway, which seemed to lead deeper into the building. This hallway was a maze of disarray. Chairs and other debris were strewn across the floor, making it difficult to navigate. We pushed through, carefully stepping over the obstacles. The first room we attempted to enter was locked, so we moved to the next room on the left. Through a partially broken window, I saw what looked like clothes hanging from the ceiling. Curiosity got the better of me. I stepped into the room, trying to make sense of the strange sight. The clothes were old and tattered, swaying gently as if stirred by an unseen breeze. As I examined them, I noticed Ryan had fallen unusually silent. I turned around to check on him, only to see his face pale with fear. My heart skipped a beat as I followed his gaze. At the far end of the room stood a disheveled man, barely clothed and clutching something in his hand. His presence was shocking and out of place, especially in a school so long abandoned. My mind raced as I noticed the man's unkempt appearance and the way he seemed to be watching us intently. Ryan's eyes were fixed on the man, a look of sheer terror etched on his face. Without a word, he grabbed my arm and yanked me back into the hallway. The urgency in his grip left no room for discussion. We barely had time to process what we had seen when we heard a metallic clang followed by a blood-curdling scream from the room we had just left. Panic set in, and we sprinted down the hallway, our footsteps echoing through the empty building. As we ran, I could hear the man's scream growing fainter behind us, but I dared not look back. We burst through the first open window we came across and tumbled out into the night. Breathless and shaken, we ran as far from the school as we could. The moonlit path seemed endless, but we didn't stop until we reached a point where we felt safe. Exhausted and scared, we finally slowed down and caught our breath. As we walked the rest of the way home, the adrenaline began to wane, and we started piecing together what had happened. The man we had encountered was likely holding a knife, which he may have tried to throw at us. His unstable state and aggressive behavior made it clear that he was dangerous. The encounter could have ended much worse if we had stayed any longer or if we hadn't noticed him in time. The experience left us both deeply unsettled. The thrill of exploring abandoned places was overshadowed by the very real danger we had faced. We had ventured into a place of our childhood memories, only to find it tainted by a horrifying encounter that reminded us of the risks we had unwittingly invited. Story 2. Between the ages of 14 and 16, my friends and I were always eager to escape the confines of our homes. We were at that stage in life where privacy and independence seemed crucial. Most of our time was spent hanging out at fast food places or exploring hidden spots in the woods near the park. We craved the freedom to be alone, away from the watchful eyes of parents and authority figures. The problem arose on weekends, particularly during winter breaks, when many places closed before we were ready to end our adventures. One particularly cold winter evening, this dilemma came up again. While brainstorming where we could go, JT, one of my friends, suggested an idea that had been floating around for a while. He mentioned his parents' old farmhouse and said it could be the perfect place to hang out, secluded and out of sight. JT had brought up the farmhouse a few times before, but we had never taken it seriously. That night, however, we were all eager for an adventure. JT assured us that the farmhouse was far enough from town that no one else would be around. The thought of exploring a deserted building was exciting, and the prospect of being alone in the dark added an edge to our plans. JT drove me and another friend, Paul, out into what felt like the middle of nowhere. The further we went, the more the landscape transformed from familiar streets to sprawling, empty fields. Eventually, we reached a wooden fence, secured with a chain and padlock, marking the boundaries of the property. Since JT didn't have a key, we decided to climb over and proceed on foot. The night was pitch black, and as we crossed the fence, I realized I couldn't even make out the shape of the farmhouse. It was so dark that there were no landmarks or lights to guide us. JT led us along a rough gravel path, explaining that the farmhouse had belonged to his grandparents. After they passed away, it had been passed down to his parents, who didn't know what to do with it. The farmhouse had been left to deteriorate for nearly a decade, with no maintenance or care during that time. We walked for about 10 minutes, and finally, the silhouette of the farmhouse emerged from the darkness. Even with the limited light from our phone flashlights, it was clear that the building was in bad shape. The roof sagged ominously, and some of the siding panels were hanging loose. The sight was both eerie and fascinating, a stark contrast to the pristine and orderly environments we were used to. When we reached the front of the house, we found that the door was covered by a large sheet of wood. We decided to go around to the back, where the door was completely missing. The interior was just as we had anticipated, dusty and abandoned, but surprisingly not as trashed as we had imagined. The furniture was largely intact, though covered in a thick layer of dust, and our phone flashlights barely illuminated the space. After a few moments of exploring, we decided to split up to cover more ground. I ventured into a hallway on the left side of the house. The hallway was dark, the beam of my flashlight barely cutting through the gloom. As I walked down the hallway, I saw a figure at the end. My heart raced, and in a moment of panic, I called out for JT, but I already knew it wasn't him. The figure was taller and thinner than either of my friends. I quickly turned around and headed back to the main room where JT and Paul were. When I rounded the corner and raised my flashlight, I saw them standing in the middle of the room, their backs turned to me. Their flashlights illuminated a figure standing at the edge of the light, a tall, thin man who was staring intently at them. The scene was chilling. It felt as though time had frozen for all of us. "Guys, let's get out of here," I said, trying to sound calm even though I was terrified. The sight of the man and the way JT and Paul seemed paralyzed with fear made it clear that we needed to leave immediately. As soon as I spoke, panic set in, and we all sprinted towards the back door. We ran into the open field, our footsteps echoing in the night. I couldn't tell if the man followed us, but JT was convinced he heard footsteps behind him. We bolted back to the car, jumping in and driving off as quickly as possible. The adrenaline made the drive back a blur, and we didn't stop until we were safely away from the farmhouse. We speculated about the man we had seen. He might have been a squatter or someone living in the farmhouse, though without a clear look, we couldn't be certain. JT said he would inform his parents so they could secure the property, but he never followed through. He was worried about getting into trouble for trespassing. That night remains one of the most terrifying experiences I've ever had. The farmhouse, once a thrilling idea, turned into a nightmare. If JT was right about the man trying to chase us, we were incredibly fortunate to have escaped without incident. To this day, I still think about that night and wonder what might have happened if we hadn't left when we did. Story 3. A year ago, I decided to embark on a camping trip after a long hiatus. For months, I'd felt a strong urge to reconnect with nature, to relive the simplicity of sitting by a campfire and falling asleep to the sounds of the wilderness. When I finally had some time off from work, I seized the opportunity. I picked a mountain range not far from where I lived, a 2-hour drive, and began preparing for my escape into the woods. I spent weeks in eager anticipation, poring over maps and photos of the area. The mountains boasted numerous trails, and after much deliberation, I chose a route that promised both solitude and serenity. My plan was simple: set up camp, relax, and enjoy the tranquility of the great outdoors. With 4 days' worth of camping supplies and food packed into my car, I set off on a crisp morning. The mountain wasn't a popular destination, so parking was limited. After some searching, I found a dirt patch along the side of the road where I could leave my car. From there, I followed the road to one of the trails shown on my map. The map indicated that the trail extended a few miles into the forest before splitting into 3 paths, each leading to a designated campsite. I was looking forward to a few days of peace and solitude, so I was content with any of the options. It took me just under 2 hours to reach the junction where the paths diverged. Each path appeared similar, so I chose the leftmost one on a whim. The trail led me through dense woods and gradually opened up into a small clearing. It was a wide, open area with fewer trees, and it looked like it had been quite some time since anyone had camped there. The clearing was overgrown, and if not for the well-defined path leading to it, it would have seemed like any other spot in the forest. I set up my tent and unpacked my gear. The campsite was serene and untouched, just what I had hoped for. I took a moment to enjoy my lunch on a fallen log, savoring the silence and the fresh air. After eating, I sat down with my journal, jotting down my thoughts and listening to the melodious calls of the birds. As the afternoon wore on and the sun began its descent, I realized I needed to gather wood for a campfire. I walked around the perimeter of the clearing, picking up sticks and branches. As I ventured a bit farther from my tent, I stumbled upon something unusual, a narrow footpath leading deeper into the woods. The path was strikingly clear and well-trodden, which was odd given that the rest of the forest seemed undisturbed. Curiosity piqued, I decided to investigate. I finished collecting the sticks I needed and set up the campfire, but couldn't shake the feeling that I should check out this mysterious path before nightfall. With my backpack in tow, I followed the trail, which grew increasingly distinct with each step. It was evident that someone had walked this path frequently, yet the forest around it remained largely untouched. After about 15 minutes of walking, I arrived at a small, dilapidated cabin. The structure was in a state of decay, with splintering wood and several boards missing. The door hung open, and it looked like it hadn't been used in years. My initial reaction was one of curiosity mixed with unease. I wondered why a path would lead to such a rundown, abandoned place. I approached the cabin cautiously and peered through the open doorway. The interior was shrouded in darkness, but I could make out some objects scattered inside. My instincts told me not to enter, but my curiosity was strong. Just as I was about to step inside, a voice from behind me startled me. "Leave. Go away." The voice was stern and almost angry. I turned to see a man standing about 10 feet away. His command was clear and forceful, and his presence added an eerie tension to the situation. He looked like he was out of place, wearing clean, ordinary clothes that seemed incongruous with the wilderness. He repeated his command to leave, and without a word, I complied. As I walked back to my campsite, I glanced over my shoulder. The man stood at the end of the path, watching me intently to ensure I was leaving. His presence and the encounter left me feeling unsettled and uneasy. I quickened my pace, eager to return to the safety of my tent. By the time I reached my campsite, darkness had settled over the forest. The thought of staying the night in such an unsettling environment made me anxious. I quickly packed up my belongings, deciding it was best to leave immediately. With only a flashlight to guide me, I hiked back through the dark forest, the silence occasionally broken by the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of nocturnal creatures. The trek back to my car was nerve-wracking, but I finally reached it safely. As I drove away from the mountain, my mind raced with questions. Who was that man, and why did he want me to leave? Why was the footpath so clearly defined if he didn't live there? And what was the significance of the abandoned cabin? The whole experience left me with more questions than answers. The sense of mystery surrounding the cabin and the man's strange behavior haunted me. I may never understand what happened that night, but it served as a stark reminder of the unknown dangers that can lurk in the wilderness. My camping trip had promised relaxation, but instead left me with an unsettling story and a lingering sense of unease.